And it looks like we're live. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to English Chat Time with Mr. Chris. So, I thought for today's video that I would do basically 5 things that sometimes derail my lessons. So, I thought of this recently because I had 2 lessons that kind of didn't go as planned, and I was just teaching what was in the book, and my students were doing an interview where they were asking, "What's your best memory from elementary school?" And after they did the interview, they were supposed to then do the top 5 in their class for best memories and kind of rank them by what they thought based on the interview. Only problem was that in one of the classes, every single student only voted for 2 things, which was sports day and their school trip. And then at my other school, every single student in the class voted for school trip. So the whole little top 5 ranking was a top 1 and a top 2. So that's kind of why I thought, yeah, sometimes things just don't go quite as planned. And one of the things I had put was that often, like, the homeroom teacher might not be in the room when you're demonstrating an interview activity, which can make it really hard to set up because you're trying to do a conversation by yourself. And even when I feel like I explain it well in English and Japanese, sometimes when I go and send the students to go do their interview, there's always a couple that are like, "What's going on?" So it definitely really helps to have the homeroom teacher in the room. And a lot of times that just happens because it's like, "Oh, okay, I got to go make a phone call to a parent or something." And then I'm like, "Oh, I don't have a teacher in the room while I'm trying to set this up." So that was one of them. And then the other thing, it's like sometimes I realize like the homeroom teacher and I aren't on the same page with the idea we're about to do. And sometimes I think that's just the language barrier. And I'll try to explain something to them and I think they understand it. And then when we get into the classroom, like they're giving the students different instructions than what I'm thinking we're about to do. And so sometimes it like makes the activity go a little sideways, but it's usually might have to like regroup and start it again. And then the other thing I put down was the indecisive student, which can really throw things off because a lot of times you're like, oh, I'll give like so much time for the students to like write on a worksheet. Like a simple question like, what fruit do you like? But then you occasionally get a couple students that just can't decide which one they want. And you can tell them in English and Japanese just to pick one. It's like, here's the book of fruits, just pick one and just write it. And sometimes you just can't really get beyond that point. And then you're looking at the clock. And it's like, you've set a timer already to try to speed them up. You gave them a little extra time, trying to get them to get going. And then you're just like, yeah, the class ends in like less than 10 minutes. We got to start this interview. And you're just not ready. So we're just going to start it. And then we're going to kind of hope that you join. And so that kind of messes up lessons a bit sometimes because it's like you end the class and like not everyone was in the final activity, which is a little frustrating. And the other thing I put down was the students need more speaking practice before they do interview activities sometimes. Like usually I'll practice the sentences like 2 to 3 times. And then sometimes you kind of feel like I think they got it, but my gut feeling is no. And then when I send them off to start the interview activity, then I start getting students like, come here, help me like read this sentence. And it's like, that's when you're like, yeah, I should have done a bit more practicing before I started it. And another thing that arises from that same thing is that students will go into the interview activity and just start using Japanese and like then just show their book to another student and be like, this is what I wrote in Japanese. And so they just end up just copying their stuff and they don't actually end up speaking English. So it's one of those things I have to sometimes just remind myself to explain to them before the thing starts. You have to use English. You can't use Japanese. You can't show your friends your book. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of little stuff like that where it's like you kind of like, oh, it'll be fine, and then you're like get into the activity and you're like, ah, I should have done that differently. So yeah, those are just 5 little things I thought of how sometimes the lesson can go a little sideways, but still salvageable. But yeah, that's all for today. Probably gonna do some of these over the weekend too, but the usual goodbye, everyone. And of course, see you next time. See you. Have a nice weekend. Take care.